Wisconsin can be so cold. The scales of justice can erode. If we accept lies big and bold, we forget we live on Avery Road.
Hello everybody, this is Eric Jose on Making a Murderer on YouTube. I cover the Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey cases, but also as time passes I've been covering other cases such as the Staircase or OJ and many wrongful convictions of youth. I go over the documents, the photos, the videos, anything case related. So stay tuned because I have many more videos just like the one you're about to see. Hello everybody, how you doing today? We're here today we're revisiting the Amicus briefs. This one today that we're talking about is the brief from the current and former prosecutors that decided to get together. It's a group of current and former prosecutors got together to make and file this Amicus brief in favor of Brendan. At the cert stage, as I've been telling all you, and the reason why that's important is because usually you don't get amicus briefs filed at cert stage with the Supreme Court. What cert stage means, for those of you who are going, what did you mean by cert stage? When you file with the Supreme Court, you file for a writ of certiorari. Okay, that's basically, and if your writ of certiorari gets accepted, then that means the court is going to hear your case. So when people are at that step where this court hasn't even accepted their case yet, there's usually no amicus briefs written. Okay? But for Brendan, 6 amicus briefs were written for him at the cert stage. So there was a lot of momentum behind this. I think the Supreme Court of the United States dropped the ball, honestly. Me personally, that's what I think. But then again, they're the ones that interpreted AEDPA to rob us all of our habeas rights. So they have a certain hand in that too. So maybe that's another reason why they denied Brendan. There's a lot of reasons, a lot of speculation that can be made, but definitely they did make the interpretation of AEDPA that pretty much stripped us bare of our habeas rights in this country. And so maybe that's why even on, they wouldn't touch this because it's habeas review and they just won't deal with it. I don't know. I mean, that's one possible meaning that those of us observing could draw from it. But anyway, so we're going to go ahead and get into it. We're going to hear all the things that the current and former prosecutors have to say. This is particularly one of my favorite briefs because I like hearing from conscientious prosecutors who are intent on doing their job correctly and not just seeking convictions to feed their ego. Okay, and I'm gonna insert at the end here a couple clips from Robert Milan that you guys can all hear. He's a prosecutor himself, and you guys can hear some of his thoughts at the very end of this. So here we go. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the amicus brief that I was actually pretty excited about, and that's the current and former prosecutors. Now, they were obviously talking a lot about the social science and stuff drawn from the psychiatric and psychological association brief. And so they were citing some of that, but the thing is they have their own unique perspective as prosecutors, which I thought was interesting. And that is that they were hammering home that this case kind of merits review. It needs, the Supreme Court really should take this case up because it really seems that a lot of places across the country, they're saying that law enforcement agencies across the country and stuff like that are just not, they're just not developing, interrogation techniques for juveniles that the Supreme Court has mandated in the past. It's just been 40 years. So it's like agencies have just gotten lax, especially since now with the new advent with DNA proving the things that it's proving. It's throwing all of this information basically into sharper leaf and making it all cut a little bit more because it's giving it that much more bite. That you can't. the thing they're talking about is that if the Supreme Court chooses to take up this case and make a decision on this and reaffirm what it means to give special care, in terms of age and physical and or mental limitations, actually, but either of those things, and how those things need to be taken into account, and not just casually, just mentioned and gone over and just passed right by it. It's special care isn't just mentioning or casually, mentioning, like the way it is with either court, with the trial court or with the appeals court. Neither one of them really looked at it and went, okay, wait a second, what are we dealing with here? Because, it's obvious that Brennan is guessing most of the time in those confessions. Some of the information he knows because he lived at the salvage yard. Some of it he knew because him and his family probably watched everything on the news every night about the place where they lived. So he had a certain amount of information, that helped him when he was trying to answer their questions, when they were questioning him, basically. There's a lot of things. But anyway, so that's what these guys are basically trying to hammer home, is that it behooves right now the Supreme Court to go ahead and weigh in again on the whole, juvenile confessions again, and to just punctuate the fact that juveniles require special care, just to kind of make all the law enforcement agencies across the U.S. kind of sit up and notice and go, oh, okay, this is serious. And that's what the prosecutors are saying here, that if the good that could come from the Supreme Court taking this case and reaffirming what it means to give special care and all that sort of stuff. So we'll move into the first part now. Here we go. Amicus submit that review of this particular case is needed to restore the public's confidence in the justice system. Millions of Americans watched the video of Dassey's interrogations in the award-winning documentary Making a Murderer, prompting a public outcry over the obvious failure of the system. The dissenters in the closely divided 4-3 decision in the en-banc review found that the interrogation video speaks for itself and decreed this case a travesty of justice by Judge Wood, and then a profound miscarriage of justice by Judge Rovner. This court has long recognized that to perform its high function in the best way, justice must satisfy the appearance of justice. Only this court can restore the appearance and reality of justice here. Alright, so now we're going to go into a bit where the prosecutors are talking quite a bit about how juveniles, as opposed to adults, perceive time. Number one, they perceive time kind of in a different way, because they say, due to the fact that the prefrontal cortex is still forming and making synapses and stuff. And so juveniles have a little bit more struggle, like really estimating time and that sort of thing. And so when they're in an interrogation room, it just seems like forever, and that sort of thing. So that's another contributing factor to why juveniles will falsely confess, along with other things, like various things like maximization, minimization, where you're maximizing what you say that you actually have against the suspect when you don't actually have what you say, or at least not quite as strongly as you say you have it. And then the minimization in the sense of where they're like, oh, it's okay, you're all right, this isn't that bad. Or they do it in another way where the cops will act like the victim was out of place or something or whatever, to try to lull the suspect. Various methods like that of minimization, where they're trying to minimize the crime itself or whatever it was that was the problem, and in order to get the suspect to relax and say, oh, okay, it's not a big deal, and they'll go ahead and confess, right? So anyways, they're talking about some of those things here. So anyways, here we'll go on into it. A juvenile's distorted perception of time, coupled with the reward of potentially being able to end the interrogation if they tell the police what they want to hear, can have a disproportionate impact on juvenile suspects, who may seize an opportunity to exit an uncomfortable interrogation that to them seems never ending. An innocent youth might jump at a chance to falsely confess out of a desire to return home, believing that his innocence will be straightened out later. All right, now this next bit I think might be my own particular favorite bit. It's where they basically start to pick and just basically rip apart the part of the interrogation, like the part that leads up to when Wiegert basically loses his, patience and says, "Oh look, I'm just going to come out and ask who shot her in the head." Okay, so they're basically going through and just picking through the part leading up to that, where they get him, where he's just like, they got him guessing. Oh, we did this, we did that. What happened to her head? What happened to her head? Oh, cut her hair. Oh, punched her. Oh, we cut her throat. And oh, right? It's just guessing and guessing and guessing and getting it wrong and wrong and wrong and wrong until finally. So they're here picking that bit apart right now, and I love it. So we're gonna go ahead and go into that now. When that did not yield a positive response from investigators, Dassey said that he punched her. Irritated, one investigator asks, "He made you do something to her, didn't he? So he would feel better about not being the only person, right?" The video shows Dassey struggling to think of something else, and he tells the officers that he cut the victim on her throat. And in a now famous portion of the interrogation, after Dassey repeatedly guessed incorrectly what happened to the victim's head, one of the investigators blurted, "I'm just going to come out and ask you, who shot her in the head?" Dassey acquiesced. He did. When asked, "Then why didn't you tell us that?" Dassey said, "'Cause I couldn't think of it." Now, the wording on that to me is hugely important. It always has been. He says, he didn't say "'cause I couldn't remember, I couldn't think of it," like he's guessing. Review by this court thus could spur departments to adopt juvenile-specific interrogation techniques, including having a friendly adult present during questioning and allowing for breaks in the questioning to account for juveniles' distorted perception of time. In addition to recommended best practices include avoiding the use of deception, avoiding promises of leniency, ensuring that the suspect understands the consequences of confessing, and refraining from suggesting that you can help the suspect if he confesses. For instance, many juvenile false confessors have explained that they confessed under the mistaken belief that they would be able to end the interrogation and immediately go home. To that end, interrogators must take special care to ensure that nothing they say could be interpreted as suggesting the juvenile can go home if he confesses. These best practices offer guidance for avoiding common pitfalls, such as using leading questions that could inadvertently educate the juvenile about what the police think happened or took place, which can be parroted back to the investigators. These best practices were developed based on social science and lessons learned from past wrongful convictions of juveniles, and critically, they run counter to the standard Reed technique and the actual interrogations of Brendan Dassey. As much anger and conflict as the 10-part series generated about the conviction of the central figure, Stephen Avery, there was virtual consensus that his nephew Dassey was screwed. Even critics of the documentary singled out the problem with Dassey's confession. Most people find it impossible to imagine why anyone would confess to a crime he didn't commit. But watching Dassey's interrogation, it is easy to see how a team of motivated investigators could alternately badger, cajole, and threaten a vulnerable suspect into saying what they wanted to hear. As Chief Judge Diane Wood, joined by Judges Robner and Williams, found in her dissent, Dassey's confession was coerced, and thus it should not have been admitted into evidence. And even if we were to overlook the coercion, the confession is so riddled with input from the police that it violates due process. Dassey will spend the rest of his life in prison because of the injustice this court has decided to leave unredressed. And as aptly summarized by Judge Alana Rovner in her separate dissent, Dassey was subjected to a myriad psychologically coercive techniques, but the state court did not review his interrogation with the special care required by the Supreme Court precedent. His confession was not voluntary, and his conviction should not stand. And yet, an impaired teenager has been sentenced to life in prison. Review here will revitalize a long-standing and critical judicial check on juvenile confessions and inspire best practices in the station house. It will also help restore the public's faith in our justice system. All right, so that pretty much wraps it up for the current and former prosecutors. Now, like I said, this one to me is particularly, I think this one probably should hit a little harder because it's prosecutors. It's actual prosecutors out there that are saying that it's unethical to do what's been done to Brendan Dassey. And that's what I think is great, because that tells me that there are some prosecutors out there that get it and understand what their job is. That, and yeah, I mean, it's just, and I'm happy to see that this many, well-respected prosecutors and former prosecutors stepped up to speak up and give Brendan Dassey a little bit of, help in this situation, because, he really was left high and dry by the Seventh Circuit majority. I mean, and when you read their decision is not very, I don't know, convincing, I guess is a good word for it, especially when it has a lie right in the middle of it. I mean, a straight up lie right in the middle of it. But anyway. But yeah, another thing that they're trying to hammer home here is that if the Supreme Court does take up this case, that it will give the Supreme Court a chance to wait to kind of reaffirm this again and get it to where all the law enforcement agencies and courthouses and everybody, that's what they mean by station houses and stuff. That's like that's where like the police officers and law enforcement agencies and DA's offices and stuff will kind of hear the bell ring out, as it comes from the Supreme Court, and they will start taking juvenile confessions more seriously. And that is what this is talking, that's what these guys are trying to say. They're trying to explain exactly how needed it is for the Supreme Court to really take this case up and to really give an opinion to reaffirm the whole special care and juveniles, and the fact that juveniles require it and everything, because it seems like maybe the criminal justice community has lost touch with that aspect. And I think it's time, it's like they also have been pointing out, it's been 40 years since the Supreme Court really weighed in on this and everything. So it's probably time now, it's time for them to kind of get everybody back in line. So that's what I hope is going to happen here, folks. But that's the end of the current and former prosecutors. And obviously we'll see you tomorrow with another brief. Okay, so that wraps it up for the Amicus brief from the current and former prosecutors. Now, I hope you all find it as interesting as I do. I want to show you one other thing here before we go out, and that is this is a clip of Robert Milan. These are the words of Robert Milan. It's from a video called the Brendan Dassey: A True Story of a False Confession. And it's a brilliant video on YouTube that you can look up. It's about 2 hours though. It's better to pick on a nice weekend, morning on the weekend to probably sit down with it. Just pack loaded full of very useful information about, the case, Brendan's case, juveniles, interrogation techniques, the way the system looks at things and what needs to change, and it's a very comprehensive video. So this here you're going to see is a little snippet of Robert Milan and some of his thoughts about what happened in the Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey cases. So have a look.
Mr. Marlin, from the prosecutor's perspective, does the lack of corroboration in Brendan's confession in the form of evidence or otherwise give you pause or concern?
Yeah, from a prosecutor's perspective, Dr. Kavanaugh and Laura and others can talk about, the child's psychological issues and the demeanor, as Laura pointed out, and those things that others look at. But from a prosecutor, the way I looked at a case was corroboration. And to me, and I've taught this over and over again, but a confession is absolutely worthless unless you can corroborate it. I'll say it again. confession is absolutely worthless unless it can be corroborated. And if you look at the Brendan Dassey case, there is zero corroboration to back up that very, very weak confession he gave. The evidence that would have been left at that scene could not have been cleaned up by the sharpest individual, let alone Avery and Dassey. There is no way they could have cleaned up all that blood. There is no way that there wouldn't have been marks left from shackles on the bed and everything else. There's no way that young woman's hair wouldn't have been found in that trailer, or semen on the sheets or the bedding. Not a chance that those things wouldn't have been found. And the fact that there is zero physical evidence to corroborate a very, very weak and ridiculous confession taken by that young man should be enough for the Wisconsin prosecutors and the Wisconsin police to walk away from that case. Fair of the courtroom versus the fair of the program?
That's right.
All right, I'll try to run with that.
Theater.
I don't know if I'm going to answer this exactly, but I'll just... A little bit, but that's all right. I looked at this, like the dean, I did a crash course on Making a Murderer this week. I watched all 10 episodes in 3 separate days, and I found myself screaming at the television and screaming at Mr. Kratz, like the rest of you. And as I broke this thing down, this is how I looked at it. It started out with the conflict of interest. I mean, how did this whole thing start going south? That they were wise enough to call in a special prosecutor, a moronic special prosecutor, but they brought in a special prosecutor, but they weren't wise enough to keep the original cops out of this. And that's shocking. So that's how this whole thing starts going sideways. Followed by Kratz's press conference regarding Mr. Dassey's confession, which was outrageous. Followed by the fact that Kratz commits a huge discovery violation by questioning Bobby Dassey during the trial about a statement that the defense attorney's never heard about before, followed by the defense attorney for Brendan Kaczynski absolutely selling him out with the investigator, followed by a series of rulings by the judge that were outrageous. One, no gag order. I mean, why prosecutors and defense attorneys are stepping up to cameras after every day of trial is beyond me. And then followed by what I already mentioned, which was zero corroboration to substantiate the confession.
Okay, so there you have it. That's Robert Milan. That's who I was talking about. I have a great deal of respect for Mr. Milan, and actually would love, if I'm going to try and maybe reach out to him if I can find some way to contact him. Perhaps I'll ask Professor Drizzen. Maybe Professor Drizzen will help me out. But I was hoping maybe if I could get him to do a call, possibly. I'd love to talk to him about CIUs, Conviction Integrity Units. Some of you may have heard me talking about here. I've brought it up in a couple lives that I've been, when I've been talking about this stuff. And what they are is Conviction Integrity Units. They're just amazing things. Like I said, they remove the adversarial process, so they remove that cost on each side. They get at things quicker by doing it through conviction integrity units. They find wrongful convictions sooner and right them quicker, so that the state ends up not having to pay out such exorbitant amounts of money because they're catching their own mistakes quicker. It goes a lot in their favor in court when it was them catching their own mistake, and so the awards will probably be just not quite so huge as when a defendant had to fight and scrape and every inch of the way and pay a lawyer exorbitant amounts of money to finally get them out. Without all that, the cost of everything can come down. That's why conviction integrity units are a big wave of the future, folks. Big wave, because although the adversarial process is good and for when it's there, when it's needed for somebody to really hash something out because something wrong is happening and they really do need to hash every detail out, then the adversarial system is good for that. But in situations like this, where we could have the prosecution or the DA's offices all over the country looking at their own and finding their own problems and mistakes before it has to get blown out of proportion and end up getting to the point where it's adversarial, where where everybody's digging in on, each side starts digging in and firing back and forth, and it becomes one of those situations. That's why conviction integrity units are so huge. And I would love to get a chance to talk to Mr. Milan about that, because it was actually in the True Story of a False Confession, Brendan Dassey, the True Story of a False Confession video, that I first heard anybody talk about CIUs, and it was Robert Milan. I later heard Tracy Strunsey talking about it in one of her Facebook videos when she was doing some videos back recently to try to explain the law to some of us, and how kind of the legal process works with certain things. And but when she was doing that, one of her videos, she was actually talking about the CIUs as well, and it's so I want to continue to talk about them so that people become aware of them, and talk about them in your area, and see if your DA's office is forward thinking in that sort of way, because look, this is going to be part of the way we can help get the justice system kind of in the right order, because obviously nobody's going to want to admit fault at this point for anything that they did wrong. That's not always easy to do, especially when there's a high-priced attorney coming at them and they know that it's going to end up costing even more money. So if you can remove the adversarial prospect of it and the exorbitant amounts of money, these things could become manageable, and we could actually right more wrongs. And so I think it's important. So like I was saying, Robert Milan is just absolutely fantastic, and I may try to reach out to him, see if I could get a short little talk with him on my channel here about CIUs and the importance of CIUs. So I will look into doing that. Maybe I'll fire something off to Professor Drizzen. It's been great here talking to you folks. As you know, I'm in Utah right now, so you'll just have to deal with me over here in the comments. So anyways, we'll see you guys. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe.